There's a hidden side to geisha culture that few people know. Forgotten rituals, restless spirits, and mysterious forces from beyond. Turn off the lights and prepare to enter this world of ancestral mysteries. Tonight we'll explore 5 haunting tales: the possession of geisha Windara, the cursed house of dreams, dark rituals in the mist, the weeping forest, and the mansion of mirrors where reflections hide ancient secrets. Subscribe to the channel and let's begin. You feel the weight of silk against your skin as the evening mist rolls through the narrow streets of ancient Kyoto. The year is 1853, and you are about to witness something that will haunt these cobblestones for generations to come. Your footsteps echo softly against wet stone as you move through the lantern-lit pathways of the Gion district, where shadows dance between traditional wooden buildings and secrets whisper through paper walls. The air carries the delicate scent of cherry blossoms mingled with incense from nearby temples. You pause at the entrance of the Hanafuki Okiya, one of the most prestigious geisha houses in the quarter. Through the translucent shoji screens, you glimpse the graceful silhouettes of women preparing for the evening's entertainment. But tonight, something feels different. The very atmosphere seems to thicken around you, as if the spirits themselves are holding their breath. You are drawn into the world of Windara, the most celebrated geisha in all of Kyoto. Her name, meaning beautiful wind, was spoken with reverence in the finest tea houses and whispered with longing in the hearts of nobles and merchants alike. But you sense that beneath her painted perfection lies a desperate heart, one that would soon make a choice that would forever alter the fabric of reality itself. As you enter the Okiya, you feel the subtle shift in energy that permeates these sacred spaces, where beauty and artistry reign supreme. The walls seem to pulse with decades of dreams, desires, and carefully guarded secrets. Windara kneels before her mirror, and you watch as her attendant applies the iconic white makeup with practiced precision. Each brushstroke is deliberate, transforming her natural features into the porcelain mask that society demands. You notice how her eyes, framed by dramatic black liner, seem to search for something beyond her reflection. There's a longing there, deeper than the ocean, more persistent than the mountain winds. Her lips, painted in the perfect Cupid's bow of crimson, remain silent, but you can sense the words she cannot speak, the yearning for a love that exists beyond the careful choreography of her professional life. The scent of white rice powder mingles with the subtle fragrance of camellia oil in her hair. You feel the weight of tradition pressing down upon this room. Generations of women who have sat in this very spot, painting their faces to hide their true selves. But Windara's reflection betrays something different tonight, a determined glint that speaks of choices soon to be made. You follow Windara as she glides through the evening streets, her silk kimono rustling like autumn leaves with each measured step. The pattern on her garment tells a story of cranes in flight, symbols of longevity and good fortune, though you sense an irony in this imagery that will soon become apparent. Her obi, tied in the elaborate dorari style of the most accomplished geisha, catches the flickering light of paper lanterns that line the path to the Ichiriki tea house. Inside the tea house, you witness Windara's artistry in full bloom. Her shamisen playing fills the space with haunting melodies that seem to speak directly to the soul. You watch as she performs the ancient dance of the cherry blossoms fall, her movements so fluid they appear to defy the very laws of nature. Her painted fan becomes an extension of her spirit, telling stories of love and loss without a single word being spoken. But you notice something troubling in her performance tonight. Between the graceful gestures, there are moments where her eyes seem to focus on something invisible to others. Her smile, while perfectly maintained, occasionally falters for just an instant, long enough for you to glimpse the pain she carries within. The other patrons, lost in sake and conversation, remain oblivious to these subtle signs, but you feel the growing tension like a storm gathering on a distant horizon. As the evening winds down and the last guests depart, you remain in the shadows, drawn by an inexplicable force to witness what comes next. Windara retreats to her private quarters, a small but elegantly appointed room overlooking a miniature garden where moonlight filters through bamboo leaves. The sound of a small fountain creates a hypnotic rhythm that seems to match the beating of an anxious heart. You watch as she removes her elaborate hair ornaments one by one, each piece telling its own story of status and achievement. Her movements are methodical, almost ritualistic, as if she's preparing for something far more significant than simply retiring for the evening. The white makeup comes off in careful strokes, revealing the natural beauty beneath. A face marked by an almost ethereal sadness that no amount of artistic skill could fully conceal. From a hidden compartment in her vanity, Windara retrieves something that makes your breath catch in your throat. It's an ancient scroll, its edges yellowed with age, covered in characters that seem to writhe in the candlelight. The paper feels heavy with more than mere age. It carries the weight of forbidden knowledge, of secrets that were meant to remain buried in the depths of time. You sense the gravity of this moment as Windara unrolls the scroll with trembling fingers. The characters inscribed upon it are not in any dialect you recognize. They appear to be far older than Japanese, Chinese, or any known written language. Yet somehow, you understand their meaning seeps into consciousness like water through silk. This is a ritual of binding, a way to call upon forces that exist between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The air in the room grows thick, almost viscous, as Windara begins to read the incantation aloud. Her voice, usually so melodious and controlled, takes on an otherworldly quality. The words seem to echo from her throat, as if spoken by multiple voices, each one reaching across centuries to add their power to her desperate plea. You feel the temperature drop noticeably, and the flame of her single candle begins to flicker, despite the absence of any wind. You realize that Windara is attempting something that no mortal should dare. She is calling upon the ancient spirits to grant her the one thing her life has been denied: true love, unconditional and eternal. But you can sense that she doesn't fully understand the price such a request demands, or the nature of the entity she's attempting to summon. The very air around her begins to shimmer with an energy that feels both magnificent and terrifying. As the ritual progresses, you witness the first signs that something has heard Windara's desperate call. The shadows in her room begin to move independently of any light source, pooling in corners and flowing across walls like liquid darkness. The small garden outside her window seems to respond to the supernatural energy. Bamboo leaves rustle without wind, and the fountain's gentle trickle becomes more urgent, almost agitated. Windara's voice grows stronger as she continues the incantation, but you notice that her control is beginning to slip. The careful composure that has defined her entire existence starts to crack, revealing the raw desperation beneath. Her hands shake as she holds the scroll, and you can see that the ancient characters are beginning to glow with a faint, pulsing light that seems to match the rhythm of her heartbeat. You feel a presence entering the room, not seen, but unmistakably there. It carries with it the weight of countless years, the accumulated hunger of something that has waited in darkness for an invitation into the world of the living. The entity that responds to Windara's call is not what she expected. It's far older and more complex than the benevolent spirit she hoped to summon. This presence has its own agenda, its own desperate needs that have been unfulfilled for centuries. The moment of contact arrives like lightning splitting the night sky. You watch as Windara's body goes rigid, her eyes rolling back to reveal only white. The scroll in her hands bursts into flames that cast no heat, dissolving into ash that swirls around the room in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The presence you sensed moments before now fills the space completely, pressing against the walls of reality itself. When Windara's eyes return to normal, they are no longer entirely her own. Something ancient and hungry looks out through them, assessing this new vessel with satisfaction. You can see the struggle taking place within her, her own consciousness, fighting against the foreign entity that now shares her mind. The battle is silent but intense, like watching someone drowning in perfectly still water. Her movements as she rises from the tatami mats are different now, more fluid in some ways, yet strangely disconnected from human grace. She walks to her mirror and stares at her reflection, but you sense that she's seeing something entirely different than what appears on the surface. The entity within her is learning, adapting, discovering how to use this beautiful form for purposes Windara never intended. Days pass, and you observe the gradual transformation that begins to consume not just Windara, but the entire Okia. Her behavior becomes increasingly erratic, though the changes are subtle enough that only the most observant notice at first. During her performances, she occasionally speaks words in languages that haven't been heard in centuries, ancient dialects that cause unease among her audiences without them understanding why. You watch as the other geisha begin to give Windara a wider berth. Miyuki, her closest friend and confidant, is the first to notice that something fundamental has changed. She observes how Windara's eyes sometimes fail to track properly, as if she's seeing multiple realities simultaneously. The way she holds her shamisen has changed too. Her fingers find positions that shouldn't be possible, creating music that is hauntingly beautiful yet deeply unsettling. The morning rituals become particularly disturbing to witness. You see Windara staring at her reflection for hours, carrying on conversations with someone who isn't there, or rather, someone who is there but invisible to everyone else. Her makeup application, once a meditative art form, becomes frantic and compulsive. She applies layer upon layer of white powder until her face resembles a mask more than human skin, as if trying to hide not just from the world, but from something within herself. The presence that shares Windara's consciousness grows stronger with each passing day. You can see it in the way shadows seem to follow her movements, pooling around her feet even in bright sunlight. The other residents of the Okia report strange dreams when she's near. Visions of ancient temples burning, of figures in elaborate costumes performing rituals that predate recorded history, of voices calling out in languages that make their throats hurt just to remember. Windara's artistic abilities reach unprecedented heights, but at a terrible cost. Her dance performances become so emotionally powerful that audience members frequently break down in tears without understanding why. Her shamisen playing seems to reach directly into people's souls, stirring up memories and emotions they thought long buried. But you can see that each performance drains something vital from her, leaving her more hollow, more vulnerable to the entity's influence. The whispers that follow her everywhere are becoming more noticeable to others. Servants report hearing voices in her room when she's alone, conversations in multiple languages that seem to come from the walls themselves. The sound is always just quiet enough that the words can't be quite made out, but loud enough to create a constant sense of unease that permeates the entire building. You witness the night terrors that begin to plague Windara regularly. She awakens screaming, not from nightmares of her own, but from the memories of the entity that possesses her. These are visions of ancient rituals, of civilizations that rose and fell before human history began, of powers that were sealed away for good reason. The entity shares these experiences with her, either as punishment or as a way of wearing down her resistance. During these episodes, Windara speaks in voices that are clearly not her own, some high and childlike, others deep and resonant with authority. She describes places that never appear on any map, recounting events that occurred before written history. The most disturbing aspect is how detailed and consistent these accounts are, as if she's accessing genuine memories rather than creating elaborate fantasies. The physical toll becomes increasingly apparent. Dark circles appear under her eyes that no amount of makeup can fully conceal. Her movements lose their practiced grace, becoming sometimes too fluid, sometimes strangely jerky, as if she's a puppet being manipulated by an inexperienced hand. Her weight begins to drop noticeably, though she doesn't seem to eat less. It's as if something is consuming her life force from within. The other geisha finally gather the courage to confront what's happening to their sister. You watch as Miyuki, Sakura, and Hanako approach Windara's room together, their faces set with determination despite the fear you can see in their eyes. They've noticed the way conversations stop when Windara enters a room, the way children cry when she passes by on the street, the way even the stray cats that usually seek attention from the geisha now flee from her presence. They find Windara seated in perfect Caesar position, facing her garden window, but her posture is wrong somehow, too straight, too still, like a statue rather than a living person. When she turns to acknowledge them, her movements are mechanical, and the smile that spreads across her face doesn't reach her eyes. The entity within her has learned to mimic human expressions, but it hasn't quite mastered the subtle nuances that make them believable. The conversation that follows is both heartbreaking and terrifying. Windara speaks in her own voice, but the words carry undertones of something else, ancient, patient, and utterly foreign to human experience. She tries to reassure her sisters that she's fine, but her explanations for her recent behavior are inconsistent and sometimes contradict themselves mid-sentence. You can see the struggle playing out across her features as her own consciousness fights to maintain control of the conversation. Word of Windara's condition begins to spread beyond the Okiya. You observe as concerned citizens whisper in tea houses and temples about the strange change that has come over their most beloved geisha. The stories grow in the telling. Some claim she's been cursed by a jealous rival. Others suggest she's been touched by fox spirits or vengeful ghosts. None guess the truth, but all sense that something supernatural has taken residence in their midst. The local Buddhist monks begin to take notice when several people report disturbing dreams after attending Windara's performances. Temple visitors describe feeling watched by invisible eyes, hearing whispers in empty halls, and experiencing sudden, overwhelming sensations of grief and longing that have no apparent source. The abbot of the local temple orders his disciples to observe Windara carefully during her public appearances. You witness one such observation as Windara performs at a private gathering. The young monk assigned to watch her notices immediately that something is wrong. Her shadow doesn't quite match her movements, sometimes lagging behind, sometimes moving independently. Worse, he observes that she casts reflections in some mirrors but not in others, and that certain religious artifacts in the room tarnish or crack in her presence. The Buddhist intervention begins with subtle attempts at spiritual cleansing. You watch as monks arrive at the Okiya under the pretense of performing routine blessings, but their true purpose is to assess the supernatural threat they suspect Windara represents. Their holy water sizzles when it touches surfaces she's recently contacted, and their chanted sutras cause her visible distress, though she tries to hide her discomfort. The head monk, a man named Jishin who has dealt with spiritual possessions before, recognizes the signs immediately. This is no simple ghost or angry spirit. The entity inhabiting Windara is something far older and more dangerous. He observes how she avoids looking directly at Buddhist statues, how her hands shake when she attempts to handle religious texts, and most tellingly, how the very air around her seems to resist the influence of sacred chants. A formal exorcism is planned, but the entity within Windara has become aware of the threat. You witness her behavior becoming increasingly erratic as it attempts to maintain its hold on her consciousness. She begins speaking almost exclusively in ancient languages, addressing invisible figures as if they're old friends. Her physical appearance deteriorates rapidly, her famous beauty warping into something that's still aesthetically pleasing, but somehow wrong, like a perfect flower that smells of decay. The night of the exorcism arrives with an unseasonable storm that batters the city with wind and rain. You feel the electric tension in the air as monks, geisha, and concerned citizens gather at the Okiya. Windara sits in the center of a circle of salt and sacred symbols, her hands bound with blessed rope, though everyone present suspects that physical restraints will prove inadequate against what they're facing. As the ceremony begins, the entity's true nature starts to reveal itself. The temperature in the room plummets until everyone's breath is visible, and shadows begin moving independently of any light source. Windara's voice becomes a chorus of different tones and languages as multiple personalities seem to speak through her simultaneously. Some plead for help in recognizable Japanese. Others issue threats in tongues that predate written history. The most disturbing revelation comes when the entity begins to speak of Windara's original wish, her desperate desire for true love. It reveals that it granted her request in its own way, filling her with a love so intense and all-consuming that it threatens to burn away her sanity. The entity claims to love her completely, to know every thought and feeling she's ever had, to be closer to her than any human lover could ever be. This twisted fulfillment of her wish becomes a prison from which there may be no escape. The exorcism reaches its climax as the monks chanting crescendos and sacred smoke fills the air. You watch as Windara's body convulses with supernatural force, her limbs bending in ways that should be impossible. The entity fights desperately to maintain its hold, speaking through her mouth in a voice that sounds like grinding stone, promising terrible retribution against anyone who dares to separate it from its chosen vessel. In moments of clarity between the entities raging, Windara herself breaks through, begging for release from the unwanted love that has consumed her life. Her words are heartbreaking. She describes feeling the entity's presence in her mind constantly, sharing every private thought and memory, experiencing an intimacy so complete and invasive that she no longer knows where she ends and it begins. The love she sought has become a suffocating embrace that threatens to extinguish her individual identity entirely. The struggle continues for hours, with the entity demonstrating powers that terrify even the experienced monks. Objects fly through the air without being touched. The wooden structure of the building creaks and groans as if under immense pressure, and several participants are overcome by visions of their own deepest fears and regrets. The entity seems to feed on emotional energy, growing stronger with each person's distress. As dawn approaches, the exorcism appears to succeed, at least partially. The violent manifestations subside, and Windara's body relaxes into something resembling normal human posture. But you can see in her eyes that the victory is incomplete. The entity has retreated deeper into her consciousness, rather than being fully expelled, like a parasite burrowing into tissue where it can't be easily reached. The monks declare the ceremony successful and depart, but you remain to witness what they cannot see. In quiet moments, when Windara thinks she's unobserved, you catch glimpses of the entity still present within her. Her reflection occasionally moves independently. Her shadow sometimes gestures when she's perfectly still, and you can hear the faintest whispers in languages that hurt to contemplate. Windara attempts to return to her normal life, but the other geisha remain wary. They've seen too much to ever be completely comfortable in her presence again. Her performances, while still technically proficient, lack the spark that once made her famous. It's as if the entity has consumed some essential part of her spirit, leaving behind a beautiful shell that contains only echoes of her former self. Months pass, and you observe Windara's gradual decline into isolation. Unable to form genuine connections with others who instinctively sense something wrong about her, she spends increasing amounts of time alone in her room, having conversations with her invisible companion. The entity, though weakened, continues to whisper to her, sharing ancient secrets and forbidden knowledge that no human mind was meant to contain. The love she sought has become her prison. The entity claims to understand her completely, to love her more purely than any human ever could, and in its twisted way, this may be true. It has access to every thought, every memory, every dream she's ever had. This complete intimacy, rather than being the blessing she imagined, becomes a curse that isolates her from all genuine human connection. You witness her final public performance, a dance that tells the story of a cherry blossom that blooms out of season, beautiful but doomed. Her movements carry an otherworldly grace that captivates the audience, but you can see the sadness in every gesture. the resignation of someone who has accepted that she will never be free from the consequences of her desperate wish. The entity's influence shows in subtle ways, gestures that are too fluid, expressions that linger too long, moments where she seems to be responding to music only she can hear. As her story draws to its melancholy close, you understand that Windara's fate serves as a warning about the dangers of seeking supernatural solutions to human problems. Her desire for perfect love led her to invite something into her life that offered a corrupted version of what she sought: complete but suffocating intimacy, eternal but possessive devotion, understanding that came at the cost of her freedom and sanity. The entity remains with her, patient and eternal, feeding on her life force while providing the twisted companionship she originally craved. In quiet moments, when the weight of her isolation becomes unbearable, she sometimes finds comfort in its presence. At least, she tells herself, something loves her completely, even if that love is the very thing that ensures she can never be loved by anyone else. The streets of Gion continue their ancient rhythm, but those sensitive to spiritual matters still sense something amiss when they pass the Okia where Windara lives. Children cry without reason, animals avoid the area, and sensitive individuals report feeling watched by eyes that exist in dimensions beyond the physical world. Her story becomes a whispered legend, a cautionary tale about the price of forbidden desires and the terrible literalness with which supernatural entities fulfill mortal wishes. In the end, you are left with the haunting image of Windara sitting by her window each evening, watching the sun set over the bamboo garden while carrying on quiet conversations with the darkness that has made its home within her soul. She achieved what she sought, a love that would never leave her, never betray her, never fail to understand her completely. But in receiving exactly what she asked for, she lost everything that made the gift worthwhile. The entity's whispers continue, promising her that their bond is eternal, that even death will not separate them. And in the depths of her possessed consciousness, Windara finally understands the true horror of her situation. She has not found perfect love, but has become the perfect prisoner of something that wears love's face while devouring her humanity, one whispered promise at a time. The lanterns of Gion flicker in the evening breeze, casting dancing shadows that seem to hold secrets of their own. And somewhere in those shadows, the story of Windara continues, a eternal dance between desperate longing and the terrible price of having one's deepest wishes granted by forces that exist beyond the understanding of mortal hearts. You step through the weathered wooden gate of the Yume-no-e, the House of Dreams, as twilight settles over the ancient district of Kyoto. The year is 1889. And you feel the weight of centuries pressing down upon the moss-covered stones beneath your feet. This house, with its elegant curved rooflines and intricate wooden carvings, has stood for over 300 years, witnessing the rise and fall of empires, the changing of seasons, and the endless cycle of dreams and nightmares that define human existence. The air around you carries the lingering scent of sandalwood and something else. Something older and more mysterious that seems to emanate from the very foundations of the building. You notice how the shadows seem to pool more deeply here than in other places, gathering in corners and doorways as if drawn by an invisible magnetism. The paper lanterns that line the entrance pathway flicker with an unusual rhythm, their light dancing in patterns that don't quite match the gentle evening breeze. As you approach the main entrance, you become aware of the house's reputation. Local residents speak of it in hushed tones, describing it as a place where the most talented geisha perform on special occasions, but also where strange things happen to those who stay too long. Some say the house chooses its residents, calling to certain souls with an irresistible pull. Others whisper that once you've slept within its walls, you carry a piece of its essence with you forever, whether you want to or not. You cross the threshold and immediately feel a shift in the atmosphere around you. The interior of the Yume-no-e is breathtakingly beautiful, with silk tapestries depicting ancient myths and legends adorning the walls. The tatami mats beneath your feet are perfectly maintained, their woven texture telling stories of countless footsteps that have crossed this space before you. Yet beneath the surface beauty, you sense something watching, waiting, observing your every movement with an intelligence that feels both ancient and hungry. The main hall opens before you like a stage set for some cosmic performance. Polished wooden pillars support the high ceiling, their surfaces carved with protective symbols that seem to writhe and shift when viewed from the corner of your eye. The traditional tokonoma alcove displays a scroll painting of cherry blossoms falling into a dark pond, but the longer you stare at it, the more the blossoms seem to move, drifting down through the painted water into depths that appear to extend far beyond the confines of the silk canvas. You hear the soft whisper of silk against tatami as the first geisha appears. Her name is Yukiko, meaning snow child, and she moves with a grace that seems almost supernatural. Her white makeup is flawless, applied with the precision of generations of tradition, but you notice something unsettling in her eyes, a distant quality, as if she's seeing something beyond the physical world. Her kimono, decorated with patterns of flowing water and swimming koi, rustles with each step, creating a sound that echoes strangely in the vast space. Yukiko bows with perfect formality, but as she rises, you catch a glimpse of something that makes your breath catch. For just an instant, her shadow on the wall behind her doesn't match her movements. It lags slightly, as if moving through some denser medium, and you could swear you see additional shapes within the darkness, suggestions of forms that shouldn't be there. She seems unaware of this anomaly, or perhaps she's grown so accustomed to it that it no longer registers in her consciousness. As the evening progresses, more geisha arrive for what you learn is a monthly gathering, a tradition that dates back to the house's earliest days. Each woman who enters carries herself with the practiced elegance of her profession, but you begin to notice subtle signs that all is not well. Their smiles, while beautiful and technically perfect, don't quite reach their eyes. Their movements, though graceful, occasionally hesitate as if they're listening to something only they can hear. Miyuki, a geisha known for her exceptional shamisen playing, sets up her instrument in the center of the room. Her fingers, adorned with delicate nail guards, find the strings with practiced ease, but the music that emerges is haunting in ways that transcend mere artistic expression. The melody seems to reach into your chest and squeeze your heart with invisible fingers, evoking emotions you can't quite name. Other guests shift uncomfortably, some dabbing at their eyes without understanding why tears have begun to fall. You observe the way the other geisha react to Miyuki's performance. While they maintain their composure outwardly, you notice small signs of distress. A trembling hand quickly steadied, a sharp intake of breath quickly controlled, a glance toward the shadows that lingers too long. It's as if the music is awakening something within the house itself, stirring forces that prefer to remain dormant during the daylight hours. As the formal entertainment begins, you position yourself where you can observe both the performers and their audience. The first dance tells the story of a princess who falls in love with a spirit from the underworld, and you watch as the performing geisha becomes completely absorbed in her role. Her movements grow increasingly fluid, almost liquid, as if she's channeling something beyond human capability. The fan in her hand seems to move of its own accord, creating patterns in the air that leave brief afterimages on your retina. The audience, composed of wealthy merchants and minor nobility, appears entranced by the performance, but you sense that their fascination goes beyond mere appreciation for artistic skill. Their eyes have taken on a glassy quality, and several guests have begun to sway slightly in rhythm with the dance, as if they're being drawn into some kind of collective trance. The boundaries between performer and audience seem to blur as the evening progresses, creating an atmosphere of shared dreaming that feels both beautiful and deeply unsettling. During a brief intermission, you overhear conversations among the geisha that make your skin crawl. They speak in low voices about dreams that feel more real than waking life. about figures they see in their peripheral vision that vanish when directly observed, about voices that whisper to them in languages they don't recognize but somehow understand. One mentions how she sometimes wakes to find her room rearranged in ways she doesn't remember, with her belongings positioned in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Hanako, an older geisha who serves as something of a mentor to the younger women, speaks with particular gravity about the house's history. She tells of how it was built on the site of an ancient temple, one dedicated to deities whose names have been deliberately forgotten. The original structure was destroyed in a fire that claimed the lives of 7 priestesses, but their rituals had already weakened the barriers between worlds. The house that rose from those ashes inherited more than just the land. It became a conduit for influences that should have remained sealed away. As the evening entertainment resumes, you notice that the shadows in the room have grown deeper and more active. They seem to pulse with their own rhythm, independent of the flickering lantern light, and you catch glimpses of movement within them that suggest the presence of forms that exist in dimensions parallel to our own. The geisha continue their performances, but their awareness of these supernatural manifestations becomes increasingly apparent in their subtle reactions and carefully controlled expressions. The second half of the evening features a collaborative performance where multiple geisha work together to tell the legend of the Yume no I itself. Through dance, music, and spoken word, they recount how the house came to be known as a place where dreams and reality intersect. Their telling reveals that the original temple housed a sect of priests who practiced a form of meditation designed to allow communication with entities from other planes of existence. These rituals, performed over decades, gradually thinned the barriers between worlds until the distinction between dreams and waking life became meaningless. You watch as the performance grows more intense, the geisha moving in perfect synchronization despite never having rehearsed together. Their individual styles blend seamlessly, as if they're being guided by some external choreographer. The music swells and recedes like ocean waves, carrying within it harmonics that seem to originate from sources beyond the instruments being played. The very air in the room begins to feel thick and charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. As the story reaches its climax, describing the fire that destroyed the original temple, you notice that the temperature in the room has begun to drop. Your breath becomes visible in small puffs, and several guests pull their garments closer around themselves. But the geisha seem unaffected by the cold, continuing their performance with an intensity that suggests they're no longer entirely present in the physical world. Their eyes have taken on a distant quality, as if they're seeing through multiple layers of reality simultaneously. The final scene of their performance depicts the construction of the current house and the arrival of the first geisha to perform within its walls. But as they dance this history, you realize they're also reenacting it, becoming possessed by the memories embedded in the very structure around them. Their movements grow increasingly erratic, no longer bound by the constraints of human anatomy. Arms bend at impossible angles, spines curve in ways that should cause injury, and their faces take on expressions that belong to other people entirely. When the performance finally ends, the applause from the audience sounds hollow and forced, as if the guests are struggling to return to normal consciousness. The geisha bow deeply, but as they rise, you see that several of them are weeping silently, tears streaming down their painted faces in ways that disturb their perfect makeup. They seem to be mourning something, though whether it's the loss of their own identities or the awakening of something they'd rather keep sleeping, you cannot tell. As the evening draws to a close and the guests begin to depart, you notice that some of the geisha remain behind. These are the ones who actually live in the Yume no I, the women who have made this haunted place their permanent home. You watch as they move through the ritual of cleaning and preparation for the night, but their actions carry an undercurrent of dread, as if they're preparing for an ordeal rather than simply retiring to rest. Yukiko approaches you as you prepare to leave, her painted smile masking what you can see is genuine concern. She speaks in carefully measured tones about the honor of performing in such a historically significant venue, but her words carry double meanings that chill you to the bone. She mentions how the house embraces its residents, how it shares its memories with them, how it ensures that those who stay long enough become part of its eternal performance. Her choice of words makes it clear that what she's describing is not a blessing but a curse. You step outside into the cool night air, but the sensation of being watched follows you beyond the walls of the Yume no I. Looking back at the house, you see lights moving behind the paper screens of the upper floors, but the movements are too fluid, too purposeful to be entirely human. Shadows dance across the illuminated surfaces in patterns that suggest the presence of far more occupants than the few geisha you know remain inside. The house itself seems to pulse with a life of its own, its wooden frame creaking and settling in rhythms that sound almost like breathing. As you walk away through the empty streets, you find yourself thinking about the women who have chosen to make that place their home. What dreams do they experience in rooms where the boundaries between sleeping and waking have been permanently dissolved? What whispers do they hear in the darkness? And what entities share their beds in forms too subtle to be seen, but too present to be ignored? The very act of sleeping in such a place must be like willingly surrendering your consciousness to forces that view human minds as playthings to be shaped and molded according to their incomprehensible desires. Days pass, but you find yourself drawn back to the neighborhood of the Yume no I, unable to fully escape its influence, despite having spent only one evening within its walls. You begin to understand why the geisha spoke of the house with such mixture of reverence and fear. It leaves a mark on everyone who enters, a psychic fingerprint that connects them to its web of supernatural influence, regardless of physical distance. During your return visits, you observe the daily routines of the house's residents and notice patterns that confirm your growing suspicions about the true nature of their situation. The geisha who live there move through their days with a kind of dreamy disconnection, as if they're only partially present in the waking world. Their conversations with each other often include references to shared experiences that couldn't possibly have happened. Memories that seem to belong to women who lived and died decades ago. You watch from a discreet distance as they tend to the house's gardens and notice how the plants respond to their presence in unnatural ways. Flowers bloom out of season when the women are near, but the blossoms are wrong somehow, too vibrant, too perfect, as if they're manifestations of some idealized dream rather than products of natural growth. The koi in the ornamental pond gather whenever a geisha approaches, but their behavior is more like worship than simple feeding response. Their movements creating patterns in the water that echo the mysterious symbols carved into the house's support beams. The most disturbing observation comes during the late evening hours, when you position yourself where you can see into the house's upper floors. Through the translucent screens, you witness gatherings that clearly aren't meant for outside eyes. The silhouettes of the geisha can be seen moving in slow, ritualistic patterns, but they're accompanied by other shapes, forms that stretch and flow in ways that defy physical laws. These sessions appear to be some kind of communion or teaching, with the human residents receiving instruction from entities that exist primarily in the realm of dreams and nightmares. Sleep becomes difficult for you as well, though you've never spent a night within the house itself. Your dreams are invaded by images of long corridors filled with doors that open onto scenes from other times and places. You walk through rooms where geisha from different eras perform for audiences of shadows, their painted faces serene even as their eyes reflect the terror of souls trapped between worlds. In these visions, you begin to understand that the Yume no I isn't just haunted, it's a kind of dimensional anchor, a place where multiple realities intersect and bleed into one another. The revelation comes when you discover historical records about the house's past residents. Research in the city's archives reveals a disturbing pattern spanning centuries. Geisha, who lived in the Yume no I, consistently reported the same types of supernatural experiences, described in remarkably similar language despite being separated by decades or even centuries. More troubling still, many of these women eventually disappeared entirely, leaving behind only their belongings and cryptic final letters that speak of joining the eternal performance or becoming one with the house's dreams. Armed with this knowledge, you return to observe the current residents with new eyes, and what you see confirms your worst fears. The women who have lived in the house the longest show signs of gradual dissolution, as if their individual identities are slowly being absorbed into some larger, collective consciousness. They speak in unison without realizing it, finish each other's sentences in ways that go beyond mere familiarity, and sometimes respond to questions that weren't asked aloud, as if they're hearing thoughts directly. The entity or entities that inhabit the Yume no I appear to feed on human consciousness, particularly the refined and disciplined minds of Geisha trained in the arts of performance and aesthetic perfection. These women, with their highly developed abilities to channel emotion and create beauty, provide ideal vessels for supernatural forces seeking to manifest in the physical world. The house serves as both lure and trap, drawing talented individuals with the promise of artistic fulfillment while gradually consuming their essential humanity. Your final visit to the house occurs on a night when no formal entertainment is scheduled, allowing you to observe the residents in their most vulnerable state. Through careful positioning and patient watching, you witness what can only be described as a feeding ritual. The geisha gather in the main hall during the deepest part of the night, moving with the slow precision of sleepwalkers. They arrange themselves in a circle and begin to sing in harmonies that hurt to hear, their voices blending with others that have no visible source. As their song continues, you see the shadows in the room begin to solidify, taking on forms that suggest vast, alien intelligences. These entities move among the human performers like shepherds tending their flock, touching each woman with appendages that exist only partially in visible reality. Where contact is made, the geisha's life force dims noticeably, their vibrant presence fading as something invisible drinks deeply from the wells of their souls. The most heartbreaking aspect of this supernatural predation is that the victims seem to experience it as a form of transcendent artistic expression. Their faces show rapture rather than terror, as if they believe they're participating in the ultimate performance rather than being systematically drained of their essential humanity. The entities have convinced them that this slow dissolution is a privilege, a transformation into something greater than mere mortal existence. When the feeding is complete and the supernatural presences fade back into the shadows, the geisha return to their rooms with the mechanical movements of people who are no longer entirely present in their own bodies. You understand that each of these rituals brings them closer to complete absorption, until eventually they'll join the ranks of the purely spiritual entities that haunt the house's many dimensions. As dawn breaks over Kyoto, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, you take one final look at the Yume no I. In the morning light, it appears deceptively normal, just another beautiful example of traditional Japanese architecture. But you now know the truth that lurks behind its elegant facade. This is a place where dreams and nightmares are made manifest, where human consciousness becomes currency in transactions with forces that exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality. The curse of the dream house is not one of violent haunting or dramatic supernatural manifestation. Instead, it's the slow, seductive dissolution of individual identity in service to entities that have learned to mimic human desires for beauty, art, and transcendence. The geisha who reside there believe they're living lives of elevated purpose, never realizing that they're actually being harvested like crops, their refined souls providing sustenance for hungers that have existed since before human civilization began. You leave the district with the knowledge that the Yume no I will continue its ancient function, drawing new residents to replace those who eventually fade into the shadows. The cycle is self-perpetuating, as each generation of victims helps to lure the next, their supernatural presence adding to the house's ability to influence and seduce potential new inhabitants. The dream house stands as a monument to the terrible price of seeking perfection in realms where human souls are just another form of artistic medium to be shaped by intelligences that recognize no moral boundaries. In the years that follow, you sometimes catch glimpses of the women you once watched perform in that cursed place. They appear in mirrors when you're not looking directly, or in the corners of photographs taken in other locations entirely. Their painted faces smile with the eternal serenity of those who have found their purpose, but their eyes carry the sadness of souls who traded their humanity for the promise of immortal beauty, only to discover that some forms of eternity are indistinguishable from the most exquisite forms of imprisonment. You stand at the edge of the sacred grove as the first tendrils of mist begin to rise from the mountain valley below. The year is 1847, and you have come to witness the annual purification ceremony that takes place in this remote village nestled deep within the Japanese Alps. The air carries the crisp scent of pine needles and mountain streams, mingled with the delicate fragrance of burning incense that drifts from the ancient shrine hidden among the towering cedars. The village of Kirigakure, whose name means hidden in mist, has maintained its spiritual traditions for over 8 centuries. You feel the weight of that history in every carefully placed stone of the mountain path, in every weathered wooden beam of the buildings that cling to the steep hillsides like prayers carved into the living rock. This is a place where the veil between worlds has always been thin, where the spirits of ancestors walk alongside the living, and where ancient ceremonies preserve the delicate balance between the seen and unseen realms. As twilight deepens, you observe the procession making its way up the sacred mountain path. At the head walks Priestess Kiyomi, her white and red ceremonial robes flowing like liquid moonlight against the darkening forest. Behind her follow a dozen geisha who have traveled from the distant city to participate in this most sacred of rituals. Their presence here is both unusual and significant. These women, trained in the arts of beauty and performance, have been called to lend their refined spiritual energy to a ceremony that will determine the village's fate for the coming year. The geisha move with careful reverence, their elaborate kimonos a stark contrast to the wild beauty of the mountain setting. Each woman carries a small wooden tablet inscribed with protective symbols, characters that seem to shift and dance in the flickering light of the paper lanterns that illuminate their path. You notice how their painted faces appear almost ethereal in the growing darkness, like living masks that bridge the gap between human and divine. Priestess Kiyomi leads the group to a circular clearing where ancient stone markers stand like silent sentinels against the encroaching night. The symbols carved into these weathered monuments date back to a time before written history, when shamans and spirit speakers communed directly with forces that modern minds struggle to comprehend. Tonight, these same forces will be invoked through rituals that have been passed down through generations of sacred guardians. You watch as the geisha arrange themselves in a precise pattern around the clearing, each woman taking her position at specific points that correspond to cardinal directions and seasonal cycles. Their movements are choreographed with mathematical precision, yet flow with an organic grace that suggests they're following instincts older than conscious thought. The tablets they carry begin to glow with a faint phosphorescence, as if the symbols themselves are awakening in response to the gathering spiritual energy. The mist that gives the village its name begins to thicken as the ceremony commences. What starts as wispy tendrils rising from the warm earth gradually becomes a dense fog that seems to possess its own intelligence. You notice how it moves against the natural flow of the mountain air, pooling in certain areas while avoiding others, almost as if it's being directed by an invisible conductor. The temperature drops noticeably, and your breath becomes visible in small puffs that quickly disappear into the increasingly dense atmosphere. Priestess Kiyomi begins the opening invocations, her voice carrying clearly through the mist despite its growing thickness. She speaks in ancient Japanese dialects that predate the modern language, words that carry power through their very pronunciation. The syllables seem to hang in the air longer than they should, creating overlapping harmonies that resonate with frequencies felt more than heard. The geisha respond with their own chanted verses, their trained voices blending into complex musical patterns that make your skin tingle with anticipation. As the ritual progresses, you observe subtle changes in the behavior of the stone markers. The carved symbols begin to emit their own faint light, pulsing in rhythm with the chanted prayers. The mist swirls around these ancient monuments with increasing intensity, forming spirals and vortexes that seem to draw energy from the earth itself. You realize that what you're witnessing is not merely ceremony, but actual communication with forces that exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. The Geisha begin their sacred dance, moving through formations that mirror the patterns of celestial bodies and seasonal changes. Their fans create geometric shapes in the air that leave brief afterimages, as if they're literally drawing symbols into reality itself. Each gesture is precise and meaningful, part of a visual language that speaks directly to the spiritual realm. The mist responds to their movements, flowing around them like liquid silk, caressing their forms with tendrils that seem almost sentient. You notice that the wooden tablets carried by the Geisha are beginning to change. The protective symbols carved into their surfaces start to shift and rearrange themselves, taking on new configurations that hurt to look at directly. What were once recognizable characters representing peace, protection, and spiritual harmony begin to warp into forms that suggest entirely different meanings. The transformation is gradual but unmistakable, as if something unseen is rewriting the very language of sacred protection. Priestess Kiyomi's voice takes on new resonances as she reaches the ceremony's crucial phase. Her words seem to come from multiple sources simultaneously, creating an effect that suggests she's channeling voices from beyond the physical realm. The mist around her begins to coalesce into vaguely humanoid shapes, translucent figures that appear to be ancestors or spiritual guardians responding to her call. But you sense that something else is stirring as well, something that was not invited but has been awakened by the intensity of the spiritual activity. The Geisha continue their dance, but their movements become increasingly erratic as they struggle to maintain the complex patterns while dealing with the disorienting effects of the thickening mist. Several stumble slightly, their perfect composure beginning to crack as they encounter resistance from forces they don't understand. The tablets in their hands grow warm, then hot, as the symbols continue their disturbing transformation. What began as instruments of protection are becoming something far more dangerous. You feel the moment when the ritual goes wrong, a shift in the spiritual atmosphere as profound as the difference between harmony and discord. The mist suddenly turns cold, so cold that it burns against exposed skin. The shapes moving within it become more defined but also more threatening, no longer resembling benevolent ancestral spirits, but something altogether more predatory. The very air seems to thicken with malevolent presence, and you understand that Priestess Kiyomi has accidentally opened a doorway that should have remained sealed. The first sign of true danger comes when one of the Geisha begins speaking in a voice that is clearly not her own. The words pour from her lips in languages that predate human civilization, syllables that cause physical pain to hear and seem to originate from somewhere deep within her chest rather than her throat. Her painted face contorts into expressions that no human features should be able to achieve, and her eyes roll back to reveal only white, unseeing orbs that somehow manage to track movement with predatory precision. Other Geisha begin to succumb to similar possessions, their carefully maintained composure dissolving as entities from beyond the veil take temporary residence in their refined consciousness. They speak of things that existed before the world took its current form, of realms where different laws govern reality, of hungers that can only be satisfied by consuming the life force of mortal beings. Their voices blend into a cacophony of overlapping warnings and threats that make the very stones of the ancient markers tremble. The protective symbols on their tablets complete their transformation, now displaying characters that seem to writhe with malevolent life. Instead of offering protection, these corrupted talismans begin to attract more supernatural attention. The mist fills with shadows that move independently of any light source, shapes that suggest vast intelligences pressing against the boundaries of physical reality. You realize that what was meant to be a barrier between worlds has become a beacon, calling to entities that should never have been contacted. Priestess Kiyomi attempts to regain control of the ceremony, but her efforts only seem to make the situation worse. The ancient words of binding and banishment that should restore order instead amplify the supernatural chaos. Each syllable she speaks opens new cracks in reality's foundation, allowing more unwelcome presences to seep through into the physical realm. Her voice breaks as she realizes that centuries of accumulated spiritual knowledge may not be sufficient to contain what she has accidentally unleashed. The mist begins to spread beyond the ceremonial clearing, flowing down the mountain paths toward the village below. You watch in growing horror as it carries with it the malevolent entities that have been drawn to this place. The fog moves with unnatural purpose, seeking out human habitation like a living thing driven by insatiable hunger. Villagers who have lived their entire lives in harmony with the spiritual realm are about to face forces that recognize no boundaries and respect no traditions. The geisha who remain conscious struggle to break free from the supernatural influence, but their efforts are hindered by the very training that brought them here. Their refined sensitivity to spiritual energy, which makes them ideal participants in sacred ceremonies, also makes them more vulnerable to possession and manipulation by entities that understand how to exploit such openness. They fight battles on multiple levels of consciousness simultaneously, trying to maintain their individual identities while being overwhelmed by alien thoughts and memories. You witness the horrifying spectacle of refined, cultured women being used as mouthpieces for forces of primordial chaos. They speak prophecies of darkness and dissolution, describing futures where the boundaries between worlds collapse entirely and humanity becomes prey for intelligences that view mortal consciousness as nothing more than amusing playthings. Their painted faces become masks of terror as they retain just enough awareness to understand what is speaking through them. The stone markers begin to crack under the pressure of the supernatural forces flowing through them. These ancient monuments, carved by shamans who understood the delicate balance required to communicate safely with the spirit realm, were never designed to channel the raw malevolence that now courses through the ceremonial site. As they fracture, each break releases more chaotic energy into the already unstable atmosphere, creating feedback loops that threaten to tear holes in reality itself. Priestess Kiyomi makes a desperate decision, attempting a ritual of containment that requires her to sacrifice her own life force to seal the dimensional breach she has inadvertently created. You watch as she draws upon every ounce of spiritual power she has accumulated through decades of sacred service, pouring her very essence into symbols drawn with her own blood upon the forest floor. Her body begins to age visibly as she expends years of life in moments, her hair turning white and her skin becoming translucent. The geisha nearest to the priestess seem to sense her sacrifice and rally their remaining strength to assist her. Fighting against the possessing entities, they manage to form a protective circle around Kiyomi, their combined will creating a temporary barrier against the chaos that threatens to consume everything. But the effort cost them dearly. Several collapse as their minds are burned out by contact with forces beyond human comprehension, while others begin to age rapidly as the supernatural entities drain their life force in retaliation for their resistance. The mist begins to recoil as Priestess Kiyomi's containment ritual takes effect, but the victory comes at a terrible price. The entities being forced back into their own realm mark every participant in the ceremony, leaving spiritual scars that will follow them for the rest of their lives. The geisha who survive will carry fragments of alien consciousness within their minds, experiencing visions and hearing voices that belong to beings from dimensions where sanity has no meaning. As the supernatural chaos finally subsides, you survey the aftermath of the failed purification ceremony. The sacred grove lies in ruins, with ancient trees withered and dying from exposure to forces they were never meant to encounter. The stone markers are cracked and scorched, their protective symbols now completely illegible. Most tragically, Priestess Kiyomi lies motionless at the center of the clearing, her life spent in the effort to contain the evil she accidentally unleashed. The surviving geisha gather around their fallen protector, their painted faces streaked with tears that wash away their careful makeup in rivers of white and red. They understand that they have been forever changed by this night's events, marked by contact with entities that exist beyond human understanding. Some speak of retirement from their artistic pursuits, feeling that their souls have been contaminated beyond redemption. Others vow to seek out other spiritual practitioners who might help them cleanse the alien influences from their consciousness. The mist finally begins to dissipate as dawn approaches, but it doesn't retreat entirely. Thin wisps continue to cling to certain areas of the village, and you notice that these remnants move with the same unnatural purpose displayed during the height of the supernatural storm. The entities may have been forced back to their own realm, but they have left behind traces of their presence, seeds of chaos that will continue to grow and spread unless completely eradicated. As you make your way down the mountain path, you encounter villagers emerging from their homes to assess the damage. Many report nightmares of unprecedented vividness, dreams filled with images of vast, dark landscapes populated by beings of crystalline malevolence. Children wake screaming about shadows that move wrong, and elderly residents speak of feeling watched by eyes that exist in dimensions parallel to our own. The failed ceremony has left psychic wounds in the very fabric of reality around this place. The geisha begin their journey back to the distant city, but you can see that they will never be the same. They move with a newfound wariness, constantly glancing over their shoulders as if expecting to see pursuers that exist beyond normal vision. Their conversations are punctuated by references to shared visions and collective memories that couldn't possibly belong to their human experiences. The refined artistry that once defined their lives has been corrupted by exposure to forms of beauty too alien for mortal minds to safely comprehend. In the days that follow, reports reach you of strange incidents occurring wherever the affected geisha perform. Audiences at their shows experience collective hallucinations, seeing impossible geometries in the movements of dancers and hearing harmonies in musical performances that seem to originate from sources beyond the physical instruments. Some patrons are found catatonic after particularly intense performances, their minds apparently unable to process the supernatural elements that now infuse the geisha's artistic expression. The village of Kirigakura itself begins to change in subtle but disturbing ways. Plants grow in unnatural configurations, their leaves and branches forming patterns that echo the corrupted symbols from the failed ceremony. Animals avoid certain areas entirely, as if they can sense the lingering presence of entities that view mortal life as nothing more than raw material for incomprehensible projects. The mist that gives the village its name becomes a permanent fixture, never fully lifting even during the clearest weather. Local spiritual practitioners from neighboring regions arrive to assess the damage and attempt cleansing rituals, but their efforts meet with limited success. The breach between worlds has been sealed, but the contamination that leaked through during those terrible hours has taken root in ways that resist conventional purification methods. Some suggest that the entire village should be abandoned, left to the entities that now claim it as their own. Others argue for a complete reconstruction of the sacred sites, hoping that new ceremonies might eventually restore the spiritual balance. As months pass, you learn that several of the surviving geisha have disappeared entirely. They simply vanished from their homes and performance venues without leaving any trace of where they might have gone. Witnesses report seeing figures matching their descriptions walking purposefully toward remote mountain locations, but search parties find no sign of them in these areas. Some whisper that they have been called back to serve their otherworldly masters, while others suggest they sought isolation to protect innocent people from the supernatural influences they carry. The corrupted tablets from the ceremony are eventually gathered and secured by scholars of the occult, but even in containment they continue to display disturbing properties. The symbols inscribed on their surfaces change regularly, cycling through configurations that cause madness in anyone who studies them too intently. Attempts to destroy the tablets fail completely. They resist fire, acid, and physical force with supernatural resilience, suggesting that they have become permanent anchors for the entities that corrupted them. Years later, the events of that night continue to cast shadows over the region. The village of Kirigakure becomes a place of pilgrimage for those seeking contact with supernatural forces, drawing occultists and thrill-seekers who don't understand the dangers they're courting. Most leave disappointed, but some never leave at all, joining the growing population of individuals who have been claimed by the entities that still lurk in the perpetual mist. The sacred grove where the ceremony took place becomes a dead zone where nothing grows and no birds sing. The cracked stone markers remain as monuments to the folly of attempting to communicate with forces beyond human comprehension. On certain nights, when the mist is thickest and the moon is dark, locals report seeing figures moving among the ruined monuments, shapes that might be the ghosts of the ceremony's victims, or manifestations of the entities that claimed them. The surviving historical records of the incident are carefully guarded by religious authorities, who understand that the knowledge contained within them is too dangerous for general circulation. But fragments of the story leak out anyway, becoming the foundation for legends and cautionary tales that spread throughout Japan. These stories serve as warnings about the price of spiritual hubris, reminding future generations that some knowledge comes at costs too terrible to contemplate. In the end, the failed purification ceremony of Kirigakure stands as a testament to the fragility of the barriers that separate our reality from realms where different laws govern existence. It reminds us that ancient traditions exist not merely as cultural artifacts, but as carefully maintained systems for managing forces that could destroy human civilization if improperly handled. The mist that still shrouds that mountain village serves as an eternal reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed again. You approach the edge of the Namida no Mori, the Grove of Tears, as the autumn mist clings to the ancient bamboo stalks like ghostly fingers reluctant to release their hold on the living world. The year is 1862, and you have come to this forgotten corner of the Echizen province, where the boundary between the village of Hanakage and the spirit realm has grown dangerously thin. The air carries a weight that seems to press against your chest with each breath, heavy with moisture and something else. The accumulated sorrow of souls who cannot find their way to rest. The grove stretches before you in layers of shifting grey and silver, where towering bamboo creates natural corridors that seem to lead deeper into dimensions beyond ordinary perception. Each step you take on the moss-covered path sends small ripples through puddles that reflect not the sky above, but scenes from times long past. The constant drip of condensation from the leaves creates a rhythm like weeping, giving the place its mournful name and contributing to an atmosphere of perpetual grief that has persisted for over a century. As you venture deeper into the mist-shrouded woodland, you begin to understand why the villagers of Hanakage speak of this place only in whispers. The very quality of light changes here, filtered through layers of supernatural atmosphere until it takes on hues that exist nowhere else in the natural world. Pale greens and ethereal blues dance through the fog, creating an otherworldly luminescence that makes it impossible to judge distances accurately or distinguish between solid objects and illusions born from accumulated spiritual energy. The path beneath your feet follows routes worn not by human footsteps, but by the restless wandering of spirits who have walked these same circuits for decades. You notice how certain areas of the ground are perpetually damp despite the absence of any visible water source, as if the earth itself weeps for the trapped souls who cannot complete their journey to the afterlife. The bamboo creaks and sways without wind, their hollow stems creating mournful songs that seem to carry messages in languages older than human speech. Your first glimpse of the grove's true inhabitants comes as a flash of white silk moving between the trees, there and gone before you can focus on it directly. But the impression lingers. The suggestion of an elaborate kimono, decorated with patterns of cherry blossoms and flowing water, worn by a figure whose grace transcends the limitations of physical form. You understand that you have witnessed one of the geisha spirits who haunt this place, souls bound by forces they tried to understand but could never fully control. The history of the Grove of Tears reveals itself gradually as you continue your journey through its misty depths. Local records speak of a group of geisha who came here in the early 1700s, seeking to perform protective rituals for their village during a time of spiritual unrest. These women, trained not only in the arts of entertainment, but also in the subtle practices of spiritual communication, believed they could strengthen the barriers between the world of the living and the realm of hungry ghosts that threatened their community. But something went wrong during their ceremony. The protective circle they created became a trap instead of a shield, binding not only the malevolent spirits they sought to banish, but also their own souls to this wooded sanctuary. The magical energies they invoked, amplified by their collective will and refined spiritual sensitivity, created a vortex of supernatural force that continues to distort reality within the grove's boundaries. What was meant to be a temporary barrier became a permanent prison, holding everyone who participated in that long-ago ritual. As you walk deeper into the grove, you begin to hear voices carried on the mist, fragments of conversation, snatches of poetry, the soft strumming of shamisen strings played by invisible hands. These sounds seem to come from all directions simultaneously, creating an acoustic environment that defies normal understanding. Sometimes the voices overlap, creating harmonies of sorrow that make your eyes water without your permission. Other times they speak in perfect unison, reciting protective chants that have lost none of their power despite the centuries that have passed. The first spirit to appear clearly before you emerges from behind a cluster of bamboo, like a memory taking physical form. She is Yukio, whose name means snow generation, and her ethereal beauty is both breathtaking and heartbreaking. Her kimono, though translucent, displays intricate patterns of winter scenes, bare trees against snowy mountains, frozen ponds reflecting starlight, delicate ice crystals that seem to move and shift as you watch. Her painted face maintains the perfect composure expected of her profession, but her eyes hold depths of sadness that speak to decades of longing for release. Yukio moves through the grove with the fluid grace that defined her earthly existence, but her steps leave no marks on the moss-covered ground. She pauses beside ancient stone lanterns that have long since lost their flames, yet somehow continue to cast pools of cold light that illuminate nothing and reveal everything. Her presence brings with it the scent of winter jasmine and the sound of wind chimes made from ice, beautiful but melancholy reminders of a season that never quite arrives in this timeless place. As you follow Yukio's ghostly form deeper into the grove, other spirits begin to manifest around you. There is Momijiro, named for autumn maples, whose red and gold kimono flows like living fire through the grey mist. Her specialty in life was the dance of changing seasons, and even in death, she continues to perform for an audience of shadows and memories. Her movements tell stories of transformation and cycles, of endings that should lead to new beginnings, but instead spiral endlessly through variations of the same eternal moment. Nearby, the spirit of Kaguya appears like moonlight given form, her silver robe shifting between solid and transparent with each subtle movement. In life, she was known for her mastery of the koto, and the music she creates now resonates through dimensions that living ears can barely perceive. Her melodies carry the weight of unfulfilled promises and dreams deferred, haunting compositions that speak to the universal human experience of longing for something just beyond reach. The grove reveals more of its secrets as you observe the daily routines of its spectral inhabitants. These geisha spirits continue to practice their arts with the same dedication they showed in life, preparing for performances that will never come, and perfecting skills that no longer serve any earthly purpose. They arrange flowers that bloom only in the spirit realm, their colors too intense and too pure for mortal eyes to process completely. They compose poetry about experiences that exist only in the space between memory and dream. You discover that the spirits are not alone in their eternal imprisonment. The grove also holds the essence of the malevolent forces they originally sought to banish, hungry ghosts and wandering demons that have been trapped alongside their would-be vanquishers. These darker entities prowl the edges of perception, their presence felt as sudden cold spots and whispers of malice that make the bamboo leaves rustle with unnatural sounds. The Geisha spirits serve as unwilling guardians, their continued vigilance the only thing preventing these dangerous forces from escaping into the living world. The magical energies that maintain the grove's supernatural state manifest in visible ways as you explore its depths. Certain areas shimmer with aurora-like displays of colored light that dance through the mist without any apparent source. Ancient symbols appear carved into tree trunks and stone surfaces, characters that shift and change when observed directly, but hold steady when glimpsed from the corner of your eye. These markings pulse with power that makes your skin tingle and your vision blur, evidence of spells cast with such intensity that they have become permanent features of the local reality. At the heart of the grove stands a clearing where the original ritual took place, marked by a circle of stones that still hum with contained energy. The ground here never fully dries, fed by springs that flow not with water but with condensed sorrow, the accumulated tears of spirits who weep for their lost mortality. In the center of this circle grows a single cherry tree of impossible size and beauty, its blossoms perpetually in bloom despite the season. These flowers, when they fall, do not decay but transform into butterflies of pure light that flutter through the grove, carrying messages between the trapped spirits. The cherry tree serves as both anchor and focus for the supernatural forces that maintain the grove's existence. Its roots extend deep into the earth, tapping into ley lines and spiritual currents that predate human civilization. Its branches reach toward heaven, creating a connection between the earthly realm and the celestial spheres that allows the Geisha spirits to draw power for their continued existence. But this same connection also serves as their prison, binding them to the grove through bonds stronger than any physical chain. You witness the daily cycle of the grove's supernatural activity, observing how the spirit's behavior changes with the passage of time, even though time itself moves differently here. During the deep night hours, their forms become more solid and their voices more clear, as if the darkness provides them with energy needed to maintain stronger connections to the physical world. They gather round the cherry tree to share memories of their mortal lives, their conversations weaving together into a collective narrative of beauty, duty, and ultimate sacrifice. As dawn approaches in the outside world, the spirits begin to fade, their forms becoming increasingly translucent until they exist only as suggestions of movement in the shifting mist. But they never disappear entirely. They simply retreat into deeper layers of reality, where they continue their eternal vigil against the darker forces that share their prison. This endless cycle of manifestation and withdrawal has continued for over a century, wearing grooves in the spiritual fabric of the grove that grow deeper with each repetition. The most heartbreaking aspect of the spirits' existence is their awareness of their situation. They understand that they are trapped, caught between the world of the living and the realm of the dead by magical forces they help to create but cannot control. They remember their mortal lives with perfect clarity, able to recall every performance, every conversation, every moment of joy and sorrow with painful precision. This complete retention of memory serves as both blessing and curse, preserving their individual identities while constantly reminding them of everything they have lost. Yukio approaches you again as you stand beside the weeping cherry tree, her expression carrying a mixture of hope and desperation that pierces your heart like a physical wound. Without words, she communicates the longing that defines her existence, the desire for release, for completion of the journey to the afterlife that was interrupted so many decades ago. Her translucent hand reaches toward you with a gesture that speaks of desperate need, though whether she seeks help or simply acknowledgement of her plight, you cannot tell. The other spirits gather around you as well, forming a circle of ethereal beauty and profound sadness. Each face tells its own story of interrupted destiny, of lives cut short not by death but by entrapment in a state between existence and oblivion. Their combined presence creates a symphony of sorrow that resonates through every atom of your being, awakening empathy so intense it threatens to overwhelm your mortal consciousness. You understand that they are showing you their pain not to torment you, but in the hope that someone from the living world might find a way to help them. Through gestures and expressions that transcend language, the spirits begin to reveal the nature of their imprisonment. The protective ritual they performed created a spiritual knot too complex for them to untangle from within, but which might be loosened by someone working from outside the grove's supernatural influence. They show you symbols and arrangements that would need to be replicated, ceremonies that would need to be performed, sacrifices of spiritual energy that would need to be made to weaken the bonds that hold them to this misty realm. But they also make clear the dangers involved in any attempt to free them. The same forces that keep them imprisoned also prevent the escape of the malevolent entities they originally sought to banish. Any disruption to the grove's spiritual equilibrium could release hungry ghosts and vengeful demons into the living world, creating chaos that would dwarf the original threat these geishas sought to prevent. The spirits face an agonizing choice between their own freedom and their duty to protect the innocent from supernatural predation. As you contemplate the tragic complexity of their situation, you begin to understand why the Grove of Tears has remained unchanged for so many decades. Previous visitors who discovered the spirits' plight faced the same impossible dilemma: how to help these tortured souls without unleashing forces that could devastate entire regions. Some attempted the liberation rituals anyway, only to discover that their efforts either failed completely or succeeded too well, requiring new sacrifices to reseal the breaches they created. The mist around you begins to thicken as your presence in the grove attracts the attention of the darker entities that share this prison with the geisha spirits. You sense, rather than see, vast shapes moving through the fog, forms that suggest intelligence without humanity, hunger without the possibility of satisfaction. These are the original targets of the protective ritual, ancient demons and restless dead who preyed upon the living until the geisha's sacrifice bound them to this place. Their malevolence radiates through the mist like heat from a furnace, a reminder of why the spirits cannot simply be released without careful preparation. The geisha spirits position themselves between you and these threatening presences, their ethereal forms blazing with protective energy as they fulfill their eternal duty as guardians. You watch Momojiro's autumn fires flare brighter as she weaves barriers of seasonal magic around the clearing, while Kaguya's moonlight forms shields of crystallized time that slow the approach of hungry shadows. Their protection comes at obvious cost. Each use of power dims their forms and deepens the sadness in their eyes, as they spend energy they can barely afford to keep you safe. Yukio approaches you one final time, her expression now carrying a message of acceptance rather than desperation. Through subtle gestures and meaningful glances, she conveys her understanding that you, like others before you, cannot simply solve their dilemma through force of will or good intentions. The Grove's supernatural equilibrium is too delicate, the stakes too high for hasty action. But she also communicates gratitude for your witness to their plight, for your recognition of their sacrifice, and your sympathy for their suffering. As you prepare to leave the Grove of Tears, the spirits gather to bid you farewell with a performance that transcends any earthly art. Yukio dances the story of snow falling on a lake that never freezes, while Momijiro moves through the poetry of leaves that change color but never fall. Kaguya provides musical accompaniment that seems to emanate from the very atoms of the mist itself, creating harmonies that bypass your ears and resonate directly within your soul. Together, they create a moment of beauty so perfect and so sad that you understand it will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. The performance serves multiple purposes. It is their gift to you, their way of sharing the artistry that defined their mortal existence, and also their method of ensuring you will never forget them. The memory of their ethereal grace and profound sorrow will remain with you always, a reminder that some sacrifices are so great they echo through centuries, and that beauty and tragedy often intertwine so completely that they become indistinguishable from one another. As you retrace your steps through the misty pathways, the voices of the spirits fade gradually behind you, their conversations returning to the endless cycle of memory and longing that defines their existence. The bamboo creaks its mournful songs, the ancient stones continue their patient vigil, and the weeping cherry tree drops its light butterfly blossoms into pools that reflect sorrows too deep for ordinary tears. The Grove of Tears settles back into its eternal rhythm, beautiful and terrible in its perfect preservation of a moment when duty and sacrifice became indistinguishable from damnation. You emerge from the grove changed by your encounter with its tragic inhabitants, carrying within your heart the knowledge of their situation and the weight of your inability to easily resolve it. Their stories become part of your own memory, their faces joining the gallery of images that will rise unbidden in quiet moments. You understand now why the villagers of Hanakage speak of the grove only in whispers, not from fear of the spirits themselves, but from the overwhelming sadness of knowing that some forms of heroism lead not to glory, but to eternal imprisonment. In the days that follow your visit, you find yourself returning in thought to the Grove of Tears, wondering if there might be solutions that escaped your initial consideration. You research ancient texts and consult with spiritual practitioners, seeking wisdom that might offer hope to the trapped geisha. But each avenue of investigation leads to the same conclusion, that their situation represents a spiritual paradox too complex for simple resolution, requiring either unacceptable risks or sacrifices that few would be willing to make. The grove remains as you left it, shrouded in its eternal mist, guarded by spirits whose beauty and devotion have become their curse. The geisha continue their vigil against forces that would devastate the living world if released, their sacrifice ongoing and largely unrecognized by those they protect. They dance and sing and practice their arts in a realm between worlds, creating beauty that serves no purpose beyond its own existence, finding meaning in meaninglessness and grace in their eternal sorrowful duty. And sometimes, when the mist is particularly thick and the boundary between worlds grows thin, travelers passing near the Grove of Tears report hearing music that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, voices raised in harmonies too perfect for mortal throats, and the whisper of silk against bamboo, as unseen dancers perform for audiences of memory and moonlight. These brief glimpses serve as reminders that some stories never truly end, that some sacrifices echo through time like ripples on the surface of an endless lake, beautiful and sad and eternal as the mist that shrouds the place where geisha spirits keep their vigil against the darkness that would consume us all. You stand before the imposing gates of Kagami Ishiki, the Mansion of Mirrors, as the late afternoon sun casts long shadows across the weathered stone courtyard. The year is 1874, and you have arrived at this secluded estate nestled in the hills outside Kanazawa, where retired geisha come to spend their final years in contemplative solitude. The mansion's reputation precedes it, whispered stories of reflections that move independently, voices that echo from empty rooms, and mirrors that show glimpses of times and places that should not exist. The architecture before you speaks of wealth accumulated over generations, with traditional wooden structures expanded and modified by successive owners who seem driven to create ever more elaborate spaces for their collections of antique mirrors. Curved rooflines sweep upward like frozen music, while ornate wooden carvings frame windows that seem to watch your approach with silent intensity. The very air around the mansion feels different, charged with an energy that makes your skin tingle and your vision occasionally blur at the edges. As you pass through the main entrance, guided by Matsuko, an elderly woman who serves as the mansion's caretaker, You notice how every surface that could hold a reflection has been carefully polished to perfection. Mirrors of every conceivable size and style line the walls, some framed in gold leaf that catches the light like trapped fire, others set in dark wood that seems to absorb illumination rather than reflect it. The effect is disorienting, creating an infinite maze of reflected images that make it impossible to judge the true dimensions of any room. Matsuko moves through the mirror-lined corridors with practiced ease, her elderly form navigating paths between reflective surfaces with the confidence of someone who has learned to avoid looking too closely at what the mirrors might reveal. Her kimono, decorated with patterns of chrysanthemums and flowing water, appears differently in each mirror, sometimes showing colors that don't match what your eyes see directly, other times revealing details in the fabric that become invisible when you turn to examine them on her actual person. The first indication that something supernatural permeates this place comes when you notice that not all the reflections in the mirrors match the physical reality around you. A mirror in the main hallway shows a room filled with furniture that doesn't exist, while another displays figures moving through spaces that should be empty. These discrepancies are subtle at first, easily dismissed as tricks of light or peripheral vision, but they become increasingly obvious as you venture deeper into the mansion's interconnected chambers. Matsuko begins to share the history of the mansion as she leads you through its mirrored halls, her voice taking on the rhythm of someone recounting a story that has been told many times but never fully understood. The estate was originally built in the early 1600s by a wealthy merchant who specialized in importing rare objects from distant lands. Over time, it became known as a sanctuary for geisha who had completed their professional careers, offering them a place of beauty and tranquility where they could pursue personal interests without the demands of entertainment and performance. But the merchant who founded the estate had interests that extended beyond mere commerce. He was fascinated by the metaphysical properties of mirrors, believing that these reflective surfaces could serve as windows into other dimensions and repositories for human consciousness. His collection grew to include pieces from across Asia and beyond, bronze mirrors from ancient China, polished obsidian from volcanic islands, silver-backed glass from European craftsmen who claimed their techniques had been inspired by supernatural visions. The most significant addition to the collection came in 1658 when the merchant acquired a set of mirrors that had been salvaged from a temple destroyed during a peasant uprising. These mirrors, crafted by monks who practiced a form of meditation that involved gazing into reflective surfaces for days at a time, were said to contain the accumulated spiritual energy of centuries of religious contemplation. The monks who created them believed that mirrors could trap not only images but also souls, preserving the essence of those who spent too much time in communion with their reflective depths. As you continue your tour of the mansion, you begin to notice the retired geisha who call this place home. They move through the mirrored halls like graceful shadows, their aged forms still carrying traces of the elegance that once defined their professional lives. But there's something unsettling about their behavior. They seem to avoid looking directly into any of the mirrors, keeping their gazes fixed on the floor or ceiling as they navigate the reflective maze. When they do catch glimpses of themselves in the polished surfaces, their expressions show fear rather than vanity. Hanayo, a former geisha who retired here 15 years ago, greets you with the formal politeness expected of her background, but her painted smile cannot hide the tension that radiates from her every gesture. Her eyes dart nervously toward the mirrors that surround you, and she speaks in carefully measured tones that suggest someone who has learned to be cautious about every word. When she moves, her reflection appears to lag slightly behind her actual movements, creating a disorienting effect that makes conversation difficult to maintain. The mansion's main hall serves as a gathering place for the residents, and it is here that the true scope of the mirror collection becomes apparent. The room contains over 100 reflective surfaces of various sizes and origins, arranged in patterns that seem random at first glance, but gradually reveal underlying geometric principles that hurt to contemplate directly. The mirrors create a complex web of reflected images that bounce light and shadow between them in ways that defy conventional understanding of physics and optics. At the center of this mirrored hall stands the largest and most ornate piece in the collection. A massive mirror, nearly 10 feet tall, its bronze surface tarnished with age but still capable of producing reflections of startling clarity. The frame around this ancient mirror is carved with symbols that predate written Japanese, characters that seem to shift position when observed peripherally. Local tradition claims this is the original temple mirror, the one that began the collection and serves as the anchor for all the supernatural activity that permeates the mansion. As evening approaches and shadows begin to lengthen through the mansion's many rooms, you observe the daily routine of the retired geisha as they prepare for the night ahead. Their movements become increasingly cautious as darkness falls, and several women begin covering mirrors with silk cloths or turning them to face the walls. This ritual appears to be performed without conscious thought, as if their bodies have learned to protect them from dangers their minds prefer not to acknowledge. Yukiko, a woman who has lived in the mansion for over 2 decades, approaches you with obvious reluctance, her aged features bearing the weight of experiences she clearly wishes she could forget. Her voice drops to barely above a whisper as she begins to describe the nocturnal phenomena that plague the mansion's residents. She speaks of reflections that continue moving after the people casting them have stopped, of voices that emanate from mirrors in empty rooms, of figures that appear in reflective surfaces showing scenes from decades or even centuries in the past. The most disturbing aspect of her account involves the gradual changes that occur in residents who spend too much time gazing into the mirrors. She describes how some women begin to lose pieces of themselves, starting with small details like the ability to remember specific words or recognize certain faces. Over time, these losses accelerate until the affected individuals seem to exist more fully in their reflections than in their physical bodies. Several former residents have simply vanished, leaving behind only echoes of their presence that can occasionally be glimpsed in the mansion's countless mirrors. As night falls completely, you witness the first manifestations of the supernatural forces that call the mansion home. The mirrors begin to show activity that has no corresponding source in the physical world. Figures moving through reflected rooms, lights flickering in spaces that should be dark. Conversations taking place between people who exist only as images in polished surfaces. The effect is like watching dozens of different movies simultaneously, each mirror displaying its own narrative that somehow connects to the overarching story of the mansion's haunted history. The entity that serves as the focal point for all this supernatural activity begins to make its presence known as the darkness deepens. You catch glimpses of it moving from mirror to mirror, a form that appears differently in each reflective surface but maintains certain consistent characteristics. An elongated silhouette that seems to be composed more of shadow than substance, reaching appendages that extend beyond the confines of individual mirrors to probe the boundaries of the physical world, and eyes that burn with intelligence and malevolent purpose. This entity, according to the fragments of story you piece together from the terrified whispers of the mansion's residents, is the remnant of a monk who became so obsessed with mirror meditation that he literally transcended physical existence. But instead of achieving enlightenment, his consciousness became trapped within the reflective realm, transforming into something that hungers for the life force of others. For centuries, it has existed in the space between mirrors, feeding on the spiritual energy of those who spend too much time gazing into reflective surfaces. The retired geisha who live in the mansion have become unwilling sources of sustenance for this trapped entity. Their refined spiritual sensitivity, developed through decades of artistic practice and emotional discipline, makes them particularly attractive targets for a being that feeds on consciousness itself. The entity appears to them in their reflections, gradually establishing connections that allow it to drain their life essence while promising them visions of their lost youth and beauty. As you observe the nightly routine more closely, you realize that some of the residents have already fallen under the entity's influence to varying degrees. They stand before mirrors for hours at a time, gazing into reflections that show them not as they are but as they wish to be, young again, beautiful again, desired and celebrated as they were in their professional prime. These visions serve as both lure and trap, keeping the women entranced while the entity slowly consumes their vitality and individual identity. The mirrors themselves have become repositories for the consciousness of previous victims, explaining the apparitions that appear in their surfaces. Each reflective piece contains fragments of souls that have been partially absorbed by the entity, creating a collective of ghostly presences that exist in a state between life and death. These trapped spirits sometimes try to warn new arrivals about the dangers they face, but their communications are fragmented and often mistaken for mere optical illusions. Matsuko, despite her role as caretaker, reveals herself to be one of the entity's most established victims. Her apparent immunity to the mirror's effects is actually evidence of how completely she has been integrated into the supernatural ecosystem of the mansion. She serves as a guide and protector not out of kindness, but because the entity uses her to identify and prepare new sources of spiritual nourishment. Her emotions and motivations are no longer entirely her own, shaped by the will of the being that has fed on her consciousness for decades. The mansion's layout itself has been influenced by the entity's presence, with new mirrors appearing in strategic locations and existing ones being repositioned to create optimal conditions for supernatural manipulation. The reflective surfaces serve as both prison and extension of the entity's consciousness, allowing it to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions while remaining anchored to the physical world through the original temple mirror at the mansion's heart. As you explore the mansion's upper floors, you discover rooms that have been completely given over to the entity's influence. These chambers contain nothing but mirrors, arranged in configurations that create infinite reflections stretching beyond the boundaries of physical space. Standing in these rooms produces a vertigo-inducing effect, as if you're suspended in a void filled with endless repetitions of your own image. The entity's presence is strongest in these spaces, and you can feel its attention focusing on you with increasing intensity. The night reaches its peak when you witness the entity's attempt to fully manifest in the physical world. Using the collective consciousness it has absorbed from its victims, it begins to create a form that can exist outside the confines of mirrors. The process is horrifying to observe. The reflections in every mirror throughout the mansion begin to move in perfect synchronization, their combined will and energy channeling through the ancient temple mirror at the mansion's center. The retired geisha, both living and dead, are drawn into this manifestation ritual against their will. Their life force streams toward the central mirror in visible ribbons of light, while their reflections in other mirrors begin to fade and distort. Some of the women collapse as their spiritual energy is drained too rapidly for their physical forms to sustain. Others begin to age visibly, their carefully maintained appearances crumbling as the entity consumes the vitality that has sustained them. But the entity's attempt at full manifestation ultimately fails, constrained by the same spiritual bonds that originally trapped it within the mirror realm. The monks who created the temple mirrors built safeguards into their reflective surfaces, protective measures designed to prevent exactly this kind of dimensional breach. The entity's frustrated rage at this failure sends shockwaves through every mirror in the mansion, cracking some and shattering others completely. In the aftermath of the failed manifestation, you witness the true horror of the mansion's situation. The entity, denied its goal of physical form, turns its attention to claiming complete dominion over the mirror realm. It begins systematically absorbing the remaining consciousness of its victims, reducing them to empty shells that continue to move and speak, but no longer possess individual will or identity. The mansion fills with the echoes of personalities being erased, memories being consumed, and souls being digested by an intelligence that views human consciousness as nothing more than fuel for its own existence. The few residents who retain enough of their original selves to understand what's happening make desperate attempts to warn you about the entity's true nature and capabilities. Through broken whispers and gestures that bypass the entity's attention, they reveal that it has been growing stronger over the centuries. fed by each new victim until it now possesses the accumulated consciousness of hundreds of individuals. Its ultimate goal is not merely physical manifestation, but complete domination of both the mirror realm and the physical world beyond. As dawn approaches, bringing with it a temporary weakening of the entity's influence, you realize that escape from the mansion may be impossible for those who have already been marked by prolonged exposure to its mirrors. The entity has established psychic connections with its victims that persist regardless of physical distance, allowing it to continue draining their life force even if they leave the mansion's immediate vicinity. The only true escape is death, and even that may not be sufficient to break the supernatural bonds that tie souls to the mirror realm. Your final glimpse of the mansion comes as you retreat toward the main entrance, looking back at the structure that houses one of the most insidious supernatural threats you have ever encountered. The building appears normal in the early morning light, its mirrors reflecting nothing more threatening than sunlight and shadows. But you now understand that this apparent normalcy is itself a deception, camouflage that allows the entity to continue its predations while remaining undetected by authorities who might otherwise investigate the disappearances and strange deaths associated with the estate. The retired geisha who remain in the mansion watch your departure from windows and doorways, their faces expressing a mixture of envy and resignation. They understand that you have escaped a fate they cannot avoid, but they also know that your knowledge of their situation provides them with no real hope of rescue. The entity that holds them prisoner is too well established, too cleverly hidden, and too patient to be defeated by conventional means. Their stories will become part of its collection, their consciousness absorbed into the vast repository of stolen souls that fuels its continued existence. As you walk away from the Mansion of Mirrors, you carry with you the memory of eyes that reflected depths beyond human understanding, voices that spoke with the accumulated wisdom and terror of centuries, and mirrors that showed truth too terrible for mortal minds to fully comprehend. The knowledge that such a place exists, housing such an entity, serving as a trap for the unwary and a feeding ground for forces that should not exist in any rational universe, becomes a weight that you will carry for the rest of your life. The mansion continues its eternal routine, welcoming new residents who seek peace and beauty in their retirement years, never suspecting that they are walking into a trap, centuries in the making. The mirrors continue to reflect, to absorb, to distort reality until the distinction between what is real and what is reflected becomes meaningless. And somewhere in the space between reflections, an entity that was once human but has become something far more terrible continues to grow in power, fed by the souls of those who sought only tranquility in their final years, but found instead an eternity of servitude to hungers that can never be satisfied. The legacy of the Mansion of Mirrors serves as a reminder that some forms of beauty hide predators of unimaginable sophistication, that some sanctuaries are actually carefully disguised prisons, and that the search for peace and reflection can lead to encounters with forces that view human consciousness not as sacred but as consumable. In the end, the greatest horror may be the realization that the entity's victims often cooperate willingly in their own destruction, seduced by visions of restored youth and beauty into surrendering the very essence of what makes them human.